Right, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak and join this panel this morning. I want to provide a bit of a New Zealand perspective on the international picture that we've just seen. So hopefully it will dovetail with what you've heard from previous speakers, and also pick up on the point made around that Diana made this morning around trustworthiness of the sector in New Zealand. So I'm with the regulator, Financial Markets Authority. We're a conduct regulator, similar to ASIC in Australia, and we're also an independent Crown agency. Our overarching statutory objective is to promote and facilitate the development of fair, efficient and transparent financial markets. And in pursuing this objective, we seek to promote trust and confidence in the integrity of New Zealand's financial services and capital markets, also in the participants and also the regulatory regime. So, the Hayne Commission, we've obviously followed the Hayne Commission pretty closely since it was initiated in December 2017. Commissioner Haynes obviously delivered his report on the 4th of February, and there's been a lot written about it since. I particularly like this quote because I think the areas of trust and governance were particularly important. And I think some of the lessons that we can learn from New Zealand are very poignant. And the same is true. We've got an opportunity now to look at our settings, our regulatory framework, and make sure it's as best as it can be. So, some of you might have been those people who watched the live streaming of Haynes over the 7 hearings. 68 days of live streamed hearings, and they were brutal. It was a horror show for many of the participants. And there was one person collapsed and taken away on a stretcher. Chief executives got an absolute grilling. And as David has alluded to, charging fees for no advice, charging dead people fees, lying to a regulator over a sustained period of time did not present the financial sector in Australia. And it's also important to remember the context for this and the build-up to the Royal Commission in Australia, because there were no less than 52 major inquiries, reviews and hearings on the financial sector in Australia post-GFC. So it was under a huge amount of scrutiny. So we've looked at this really closely. There were 76 recommendations across financial advice, superannuation, banking and insurance. And the key things that emerged from Haynes covered culture, importantly, governance, remuneration, and also the approach to the regulators, which did come under quite a bit of attack. So, as we've looked at it, we've done quite a bit of analysis and reviewed this. Obviously, we've extracted some themes which we're actively talking to industry participants in New Zealand about, and think there's some really important lessons for us to learn. And the first one is this: while there were moral and ethical failings and even legal breaches on behalf of individuals, Haynes shared responsibility for that misconduct back to those who were in charge. So he was really clear that responsibility lay with those who managed and governed the entities concerned. Next, he developed what he saw as 6 norms that should underpin conduct. And these are quite basic and simple things, well-established norms, things like obey the law, do not mislead, act fairly, provide services that are fit for purpose, deliver services with reasonable care and skill, and when acting for another, act in their best interests. So he described these as fundamental precepts of conduct. The next point here is conduct and reward. And here we observed that remuneration structures at play were a driver of a culture that promoted profit over services to customers and also compliance with the law. And he was very big on that. You saw that Greg comment before. He also made this comment that advisors became sellers and sellers became advisors. Next was the asymmetry of power and information. And the point here was that there's a marked imbalance in power and knowledge between consumers and providers. And Haynes concluded that that enabled firms to act the way that they did. And lastly, there was issues with intermediation and conflicts associated with that, and we heard a little bit about the duties and the interests. And the point there was that self-interest is a powerful force. So, in New Zealand, coming back to what Reserve Bank and the FMA did, as we watched the Haynes Commission unfold in the early part of last year, we became concerned about confidence in financial institutions in New Zealand, particularly given the parentage of a number of large players, the banks in Australia. So that was the catalyst for us asking ourselves the question, what should we be doing here to check on the culture and the conduct of those institutions in New Zealand. So given the impact on confidence and also the potential for complacency, the Chief Executive of the FMA and the Governor of the Reserve Bank called in the Chief Executives in the early part of May and launched what effectively became our Conduct and Culture Review. So we wrote to all of the Chief Executives and asked them to provide a range of information around how they're conducting their business, what systems and controls they have in place, what governance they have in place. So banks and then followed life insurers had to comply with that and receive that information. So the objective was to understand whether there was widespread conduct and culture issues in New Zealand, retail, banks and life insurers, and also to understand how firms went about identifying conduct risks and how they remediated those issues. So as you see there, the numbers are nothing like the scale of the Haynes review, but we reviewed 11 banks, 16 life insurers. We did a lot of interviews, and importantly, these were across organisations, from chief executives, board chairs, down to frontline staff, and they were conducted around New Zealand, so we didn't just kind of get the head office view. We received a lot of information. We did a consumer survey. You might have seen that reported yesterday, a reference to that yesterday. We spoke to a large number of intermediaries and financial advisors, and we also spoke to 10 stakeholder groups that included industry associations, bank workers unions, consumer and advocacy groups, and also dispute resolution schemes, just to provide us a bit of an external view. I guess the important point related today that's being referenced is that the large Australian-owned banks in New Zealand have 58% of funds under management for KiwiSaver. In addition to that, AMP, who was part of our review, had another 10% of funds under management. So what did we find? Well, our framework first, there wasn't a manual for this. Nobody's done this sort of review in New Zealand before. We went back to a conduct guide that FMA had produced in 2017 to provide us a little bit of a framework. And we came up with these kind of 4 core themes that we looked at and assessed businesses against. So customer outcomes, conduct, culture, governance, risk management, and then identification and remediation of issues. We built a multidisciplinary team between Reserve Bank and the FMA, and then got stuck into it. So we were pretty much in the banks for about 4 months, from May until September. We produced the report on the 5th of November, and we staggered that with the life insurers from July until October and delivered that report at the end of January. So what we found was this. Probably important to start with the headline finding, given the objective of the review, was that in the banks, while we did find some poor conduct, they were in isolated pockets and it wasn't widespread. We did, however, find a number of areas of significant concern and weakness. Probably headlining that was a lack of robust systems and controls. While banks are highly sophisticated, I guess, in terms of their financials, they've largely overlooked the non-financials. And if you have a look at the APRA report in Australia, they really hone on this particular point. So conduct management and governance vary considerably. You'd imagine the larger banks did have more sophisticated systems, but overall it was largely weak. There was very little reporting of complaints and measuring customer outcomes, very little ability to compare complaints and come up with a systems view around what that complaints information is telling you. Very little reporting going up to boards, many boards actually not getting anything. In terms of customer complaints, despite the fact that a number of board members told us that that's the sort of information that they'd like in order to make changes and ensure that it's addressed. Banks, largely as a proxy for customer outcomes, are looking at customer satisfaction. So they're using things like the Net Promoter Scores. And overall, there was insufficient board ownership and accountability for what's going on in regard to conduct risks within their business. We did find a large number of issues that had been identified over the course of the review. There was about 50 remediation activities in place or that had just been completed as part of the review, and there was about 431,000 customers impacted by that, and it was about $25 million, I think, was last count where that was at. And often those issues were the result of poor systems, legacy systems, a lot of manual controls and overrides, and that's where we saw particular weakness and need investment required. There were some positives, and one of those positives was the kind of community spirit and connection that a lot of the branches felt they had with their customers. And this was perhaps an important differentiator from Australia. So in regard to the life insurers, it was a slightly different story. They were worse on the whole, and we said in our media release when we put out a report that it showed the industry in poor light. Well, we found several examples of poor conduct and some kind of cases of potential misconduct. Again, we couldn't categorise that as being widespread. There were serious issues, and many of those were similar to Australia, actually, and we're investigating a number of cases still at the moment. Some of those we outlined in the report, examples of selling products to people who are completely ineligible for them, companies having identified issues with the products, charges that go back 5 years, not doing any remediation unless customers actually complained. So there's numerous instances we could quote, but I won't bore you with those details. We found extensive weaknesses in the governance and also the systems and controls similar to banks, and just a lack of focus on good customer outcomes. And remediation of conduct issues was generally poor, as was the identification and reporting of complaints. So we see there needs to be a lot of work in that area. There was a lack of oversight as well of advisors and intermediaries, and in some cases life insurers told us that they don't have any direct contact. They don't see the end customer as being their customer. They see the intermediaries as being their customers. So that was quite an interesting observation that came out of the report. And we were also concerned around the sales incentives that created a risk of prioritising sales over good outcomes for customers. So we've made a number of recommendations around that. There were a couple of high points. One of them was the way in which claims staff actually deal with claims that come in the door. People on the whole were very happy with the way that the claims systems worked, and staff in that area obviously had customer interests very high in mind. So, expectations that came out of that for us as regulators. I've got to speed up a bit here. Boards taking ownership of conduct risks. We've required action plans and responses from all of the banks. We've got those in the door. We're now looking at those action plans. We've given life insurers until the 30th of June to come back with their action plans to address the issues in their specific business, because we gave them individual feedback, that is, and also the general recommendations. And we've asked them also to look at reviewing all their incentive structures internally and externally. We've asked them to remove all incentives linked to sales measures for frontline and all layers of management, to review commission structures and volume-based incentives for intermediaries, and to change qualifying criteria for stock commissions. Moving on. So the challenge we've put out to the industry, and it's been really great to work with the industry on the response to this. We're doing individual workshops for boards and CEs, FMA and RBNZ are meeting with all the individual boards. We really believe it's time for a transformation of culture within these firms and to put customer interests front and centre. we see customer confidence as critical to the effective functioning of the industry, and it requires real leadership on behalf of the industry and those in charge of the organisations to make a difference. We also see a need to rebalance focus between shareholder and customer interests. Rob Everett talked about this in a recent speech, which you can look at on our website. And banks and insurers need to think beyond the minimum. A lot of them just kind of have been interested in meeting the minimum standards without going any further beyond that. And then we identified a number of regulatory gaps. And in this regard, actually we'll just go back. In regard to the regulatory gaps, there's probably 4 key things that we've identified that we've suggested to the government that they consider. So those are obligations around customer interests and outcomes, requirement for adequate systems and controls, supervision and enforcement resources and powers for the regulator, and accountability for misconduct in the organisations themselves. The government has said it's going to fast-track consumer protection measures. Any day a discussion, consultation document is going to come out of that, and the Minister has said he's committed to looking to introduce legislation by the end of the year, and he might talk to that later this afternoon. So, future focus for FMA, obviously we've got a lot of work that we're going to need to do on our future remit in conjunction with the government. In regard to kind of culture recommendations, we see that they apply across the board to all financial service providers in terms of considering the culture, the governance, the risk management functions that they have in their businesses. We're also looking at our strategic risk outlook, something that my team's doing. We're taking a sector view approach to that, so we're looking at specific sector risks, cross-cutting sector risks, and long-term issues. One of those longer-term issues that we've touched on today is, of course, demographics, changing demographics and ethnic diversity in New Zealand. We're concerned around how some financial service providers may target specific groups, and we're also concerned around vulnerability emerging in a number of those groups. Key say default providers review. In legislation, every 7 years there needs to be a review of the default provider arrangements. There was one, the next one is 2021, so a discussion document will be out on that very shortly, and a tender process that we conducted next year. And it would be remiss not to talk about investor engagement. We said that's been critically important. The collective efforts of many people in this room. We're going to be reviewing our strategic approach to investor engagement next year, continuing work on both the buy side and sell side. So I'll finish there and look forward to questions. Thank you.